Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my sensitive friends. Welcome to episode 112, where we are going to be diving into perfectionism and how that shows up in us and how it impacts our lives and our relationships. And of course, how you can free yourself from its ravaging effects on your life and your relationships. And I wanted to touch on this topic or to look at it from a couple different angles because it's so common in highly sensitive people. And I think it's common because we're so conscientious by nature, we're so caring, we tend to have gotten the message quite early on that in certain ways we don't measure up. And as highly sensitives, we are more vulnerable to the effects of trauma. We may even have developed some of our sensitivities because of early trauma. And so there's this tendency to compensate, to have these sort of defense mechanisms when we have trauma, right? Or when we've gotten these messages that we don't measure up, right? So many of us may fall to using perfectionism to compensate, to sort of protect ourselves. And we'll get into that more as we go further in this podcast. Now, perfectionism can look kind of pretty sometimes. And some of us don't realize that it's actually oftentimes detrimental and ultimately kind of sabotages us in the end. In other words, it's a strategy that doesn't serve us as adults who want a good life, a good marriage, a good relationship with ourselves, who want, fulfillment and joy in our lives, right? So today we're going to talk about how perfectionism affects us in general and spend some time with what helps shift us out of it. And then next week, we're going to talk about its more in depth, its impact on marriage and how we can shift out of that negative impact that it has on our marriages. And I need to be honest with you. I've been kind of laughing at myself in a good way. I've been having a good humored chuckle, like a loving chuckle about myself as I prepared the notes for this podcast. Because ironically, my old habit of perfectionism really tried to come along for the ride on this podcast episode. I kept thinking, I need to say the things that really resonate. I need to really make it make sense to them. I need to make sure this podcast episode is super useful for them and succinct, not all wordy and jumbled, right? I need to make sure it gives them some solid takeaways, that it seems relevant for a relationship podcast, that I don't ramble, that I don't leave them confused, right? You see how I had all this thinking that's like, I need to get it right. I need to make it awesome, right? And under that was really this old insufficiency thinking that I'm very familiar with, that was such a part of my life in the past, which is if I don't get it right, if I don't make it awesome, they won't think well of me. You as my listener won't think well of me. That you won't like me, right? And as this was kind of going on in the depths of my unconscious, and I was actually somewhat conscious of it, right? That's why I'm able to talk about it. I was feeling this palpable pressure in my chest and belly and sort of nauseous, right? And I wasn't able to think clearly. I felt a bit paralyzed. Now, although I've addressed my perfectionism a ton and overcome it hugely, every once in a while, like if there's a really close deadline, like with this particular episode, I kind of put this one off till close to when it's going to be published. And that, like, oftentimes that's when my perfectionistic old patterning rears its head. And I want to say this up front. This is part of the process of change with old habits of mine, old brain patterns. Especially deeply held ones like this one is for me, right? We can make huge progress with them, like I have with this pattern, but sometimes they still echo within us. Luckily, I know how to handle it, and I'm going to tell you how I did today around this episode, later today in this episode. But first, I want to share more about what perfectionism is and how it affects us. So there is a definition that I found for perfectionism. I mean, there's various ones, but I kind of liked this one. Perfectionism is a personality trait characterized by a person striving for flawlessness and setting high performance standards, accompanied by critical self-evaluations and concerns regarding others' evaluations. I think that's a fairly good summary. I don't actually think of it as a personality trait, though, as in this is who you are, or like as in the high sensitivity as a personality trait. It's more of a defense or protection mechanism that we develop that leads to habituated thought and behavior patterns. Which is good news because it means you can undevelop it. So how can you tell if you tend towards perfectionism? First off, please know that perfectionism, again, is an adaptive response coming from a protective, caring place within you. And it's meant to keep you well, although it tends to cause more suffering than wellness in our life and our relationships. But it really is a primal way of loving and supporting yourself. So please know and keep in mind throughout this whole podcast that perfectionism is not bad, and that you can find more successful ways to support yourself to really thrive in life and love, right? But first, you've got to see what's holding you back, right? You've got to identify and see your perfectionism tendencies. So I'll share some of what that might look like. And the truth is, this is a giant topic. There are actually people whose whole podcast, right, hundreds of episodes are all about perfectionism. So this episode, we're not going to be covering everything, right? We're going to be doing somewhat of an overview, but I'm also going to be giving you some really tangible source shifting things you can do. Meaning things to help you deeply heal and shift what's creating the perfectionism and the painful results that it leads to. All right, so perfectionism can kind of sound like inside of yourself, by doing this thing right, whatever this thing is, or perfectly. Maybe it's like getting, an example might be getting an A in school, or saying just the right thing, or looking just the right way, right? Or cooking just the right meal, right? So by doing this thing right or perfectly, I will be worthy of praise from myself and others. That's kind of the essence of perfectionism, right? So you may have a perfectionistic tendencies if you tend to feel bad about yourself, like you're not smart enough or worthy or good enough when you don't achieve something in just the way you want, or if you make a mistake. Yeah, so just as I share these things, just take note. Does this sound familiar? Does this resonate? Is this something that goes on for you? You may be a perfectionist if you tend to do all you can to not fail at things. If you tend to avoid what you really want to do, right? Avoid doing what you long to do in your heart of hearts. Like, for example, painting, because you worry you won't do it well or right. If you tend to compare yourself to others, if you worry that others won't approve or care about you if you make a mistake, if you tend to fear you'll let others down if you don't do something a certain way, if you find you tend towards controlling the outcome of things, if you tend towards overthinking and procrastination, that can be a sign of perfectionism. If you tend to get angry or intolerant or frustrated when others make mistakes, or you tend to judge other people harshly, or you look for and focus on the most negative aspects of a situation, if you don't slow down to acknowledge and celebrate your successes, if you sometimes or often feel like kind of on that hamster wheel of produce, achieve, accomplish, if you act sweet and kind and people please so as to earn approval. Yes, people pleasing and perfectionism are often linked, especially in highly sensitive people. So if you resonated with any of those things, you might be like, well, but this just sounds like highly sensitive, high sensitivity, right? I'm like, well, yes, there's a lot in common there. And that's because often perfectionism, I think some of the perfectionism tendencies are so deeply woven into, or such a common adaptation or protective strategy for sensitive people that it almost feels like part and parcel of the same trait, but it's not necessarily. You can absolutely be a highly sensitive person without perfectionism, and you'll be a much happier one when you find your way there. But let's talk about where it comes from. Like, why do people and highly sensitive people develop perfectionism? Similar to people pleasing, perfectionism is a benevolent, well-intentioned defense strategy or protective strategy to keep us well, to make our lives good. But like so many unconscious strategies in us humans, it usually leads to the opposite of wellness. So think about it. If you have perfectionistic tendencies, growing up as a child, it was likely the way that you, which is so common for highly sensitive people, got attention and love for being good at things, for getting good grades, for doing things well, for being sweet and kind. And so if this is how we got attention, how people liked us, right? How we got validation and love, we attached our sense of self-worth to those things, to working hard and getting things just right and looking lovely and being sweet and kind. In other words, being perfect. So this was a pattern we developed as kids, most likely. And so now as adults, it's still our unconscious strategy to feel validated and good enough. Another way to put it is perfectionism is often an underlying deep-seated fear of not being good enough. And so therefore thinking that if we do things perfectly, we can gain that good enoughness. And ultimately, it's an internal safety and self-worth issue that says, if I'm not sufficient, if I'm not good enough, I'm not safe. Another way of putting it is it's a confused attempt of trying to be good enough to make up for an underlying sense of not enoughness. An unconscious, unevolved strategy to try to protect ourselves against shame and a sense of insufficiency or not enoughness, right? And gain internal safety and worth by doing things super well, perfectly. But of course, usually the opposite is what happens, right? If we're always needing to prove our worth by being perfect, by getting everything just right, And because we will never be perfect, right? That's unattainable. We will never reach that place of sufficiency and safety. But we'll be striving and pushing to do so. Because we really can never accomplish our way into feeling sufficient and worthy. We can't perfect our way out of shame and insufficiency. It just doesn't work that way. It's like a Band-Aid approach. The wound is still festering under the surface. Now, of course, it makes sense that we don't want to feel shame and insufficiency, right? And as HSPs, because of how deeply we feel, of course we don't want, we especially don't want to feel those quote unquote negative emotions, like those painful emotions, right? They're some of the worst, shame and insufficiency. So of course it makes so much sense that aiming for perfection would seem to help us. But the truth is it doesn't help. Perfectionists are simply confused about where our worth really comes from, right? It's a mistake of believing that our worth comes from what we do instead of just who we are. It's a mistake of not recognizing your amazingness just as you are. A mistake of not realizing that you don't need to do anything to be worthy and lovable and just wonderful. And what an innocent seeming mistake it can seem. But it's actually a big mistake because perfectionism masks itself as protection against emotional pain. But it actually leads to more of it. It leads to lots of disappointment in yourself and others, a gripping fear of failure. And in my clients, I've seen that it can lead to an aversion to anything but positive emotions, right? And more rejection and discomfort with painful emotions, which actually only makes them worse. I've talked about this in various episodes, including episode 31, negative emotion aversion and authenticity inhibition. Go listen to that one if you want to hear more about this piece of it. Perfectionism tends to keep us in this perpetual sense of being under pressure from our own selves and sort of this never-ending sense of never enoughness, self-doubt, self-rejection. It keeps us working super hard, always kind of striving to do super well. And it's true that you may get some praise this way and some success, but at what cost, right? It keeps us being hard on ourselves, self-judgmental, fault-finding. We're looking for faults in ourselves, right? You've heard me talk about flaw sight if you've been listening to this podcast for a while. Well, this is we turn those flaw sight eyes on ourselves and just look with these critical eyes at ourselves, right? It leads to compare and despair, right? The despair part is the key thing here. Right? When we're always monitoring ourselves for our shortcomings and judging ourselves, we're going to feel bad. We're not going to feel good, right? Because of course, when we're looking for our shortcomings, we're going to find them inevitably. That's just how it works when we look for something. And that's just going to lead to feeling more insecure, more deficient, more insufficient. Right? And then we're going to try harder and push ourselves to be better. We're going to find ourselves maybe steamrolling through our days and really caught in a joyless, exhausting cycle. So if any of this sounds familiar, you are not alone. I've talked to so many women with this experience, and it's been my deep experience too. So a little bit of backstory. I already told you about how my perfectionism showed up recently today. But in the past, it was such a powerful gripper and driver in my life. Perfectionism was one of my own primary strategies to compensate for my underlying sense of inadequacy. Specifically, looking back, I saw it in my life, the peak of it in high school. And in high school, where that pattern was the most obvious was around schoolwork. I probably talked about this before on the podcast. Like I was obsessed with getting perfect grades. And because my brain has never been the kind that can like push out a paper in like 45 minutes, like a 3-page paper in 45 minutes, I was working just all the time. I would work till like 10 at night. I would work all day on the weekends to the exclusion of fun and joy. Now, this was not all of my high school career. I think it was specifically my freshman and sophomore year were particularly bad. I started to learn a little bit more balance later on. But like it was the way that I earned my worth. If I remember one time getting it B or something and being like, oh my God, this is terrible, right? Like I'm such a failure and just feeling horrible. It also showed up for me in like my using my voice, like speaking up. So in the classroom, it would be like I had this idea that I had to say something brilliant. And so I wouldn't say anything at all because nothing that I could think of was brilliant. And in fact, what it would do, having this idea, like this drive to be perfect in my speech, actually made my brain go blank, right? Because I had so much pressure on myself and such a sense of not enoughness. If I didn't do it, it just would freeze my nervous system. And so in high school, I was that kid who would never say anything in class. And when I was asked to, I would really fumble and usually not say anything like interesting or right. And then I would feel worse about myself. I'd feel lame and like a failure. And this would often also show up socially with certain people, right? Like people I think that just weren't, I don't know, maybe that I like super admire, like the cool kids, right? It would be that whole same cycle. And I would feel totally uncool. Now, the speech stuff, like using my voice, I've overcome that quite a bit. I would never be here making a podcast and talking to you all without having moved through so much of that. So this is evidence to me of like releasing so much of this perfectionism in my life. But I've still struggled sometimes, and I've made huge progress, like I said earlier, around this piece of, making a really great podcast or saying the right things in my work, writing that email really well. It used to take me hours. Like if any of you have been following me for like the last 8 years or so, like those original blogs that I was writing way back in the day, those took me hours. And now I can pump one out like in a half an hour. And sometimes I'll have to go back and edit it for a little bit more. But like my point being, it's been a long recovery road for me. And I have come such a long way, but I am still working on breaking this habit, particularly when it comes to my work and recovering from the nervous system depletion it led to. Like I can look back at my life and see that this perfectionism tendency that I've had around work in particular has led to chronic health issues and a whole lot of emotional suffering and sense of insufficiency or not good enoughness that I could have avoided had I not developed the perfectionism tendency in the first place or learned how to melt it and soften it earlier on in my life. Because perfectionism robs us of so much. It robs you of so much, my friend, if you are a recovering perfectionist like me. And I'm just going to go through a little bit more. I've already shared some of what it can lead to, but let's talk about a bit more of it. One of the things I've noticed is it can lead to this focus on the destination kind of attitude versus living a rich life now. It's kind of like this idea like, oh, I'll be happy when I accomplish this thing, when I do this thing really well, which really leaves you forever unhappy and not enjoying the life you are actually currently living. which is the only time you can live, is current, in the present, right? As I mentioned earlier, perfectionism leads to this unsafe internal environment, right? Like this constant measuring yourself against some ideal. Some ideal, by the way, that most likely you didn't create. Like an arbitrary ideal, right? Like maybe for you, perfectionism, for a lot of women, perfectionism can show up in how, like our looks, like trying to be the ideal weight or look like the perfect woman, right? The perfect body, the perfect face, perfect hair, right? Just notice that that's that ideal that you're striving for is actually just some random human's idea of what beauty is, perfection is. It's not actually like the truth, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder and all that, right? But our society is like, this is what's beautiful. This is the standard of beauty, right? And then we all like try to perfect ourselves to look like that. Like, why do we give so much authority to others, right? To this arbitrary idea of what's perfect, right? Anyway, that was a little side tangent. I just think it's fascinating that we do that. It's like perfection is this arbitrary thing that other people thought of. It might not even be what if we were all on our own and like making our own decisions about what's good and what's beautiful, right? We might have found something totally different. So in any case, perfectionism leads to constant measuring ourselves against some ideal and never accepting our humanness, right? The humanness in ourselves. Never just feeling love for the incredible being that we just are, that you just are. And some of the ways that it actually impacts our marriages, I'm going to talk more next week. It's really like this ripple effect of what it does inside of us, perfectionism, right? So perfectionism has this ripple effect from within ourselves and it out into our marriages. And I'm just going to list some of those. It leads to a lack of playfulness and over seriosity, right? Because it's all about getting things right. It's very hard to feel light and playful and relaxed when we're working so hard at being perfect, at getting things right. Right? It drives us to stay super busy, right? Like work so hard, as I've talked about. And what that can lead to is withdrawing from the present moment, right? Being unable to, maybe attend to what's most important in our lives, like our families and our loved ones. I know that was a symptom for me of my perfectionism is like, especially in the early days of my business, is like actually not making a lot of time to spend with my family. Even though I know that that's one of my deepest held values is being with my family a lot, right? But I was so busy trying to get everything right that I didn't make time for them. And I didn't have a lot left over for them either, right? Okay, another thing that it can lead to in our relationships is a tendency to take things really personally, to focus on our own faults and of course other people's faults, but also like everything that hints at criticism from other people can be sort of taken super harshly inside of us, right? When we're perfectionists. And again, this is because of the self-worth issues, right? This can really also lead to like not being able to learn from feedback if we pick up any criticism in it. So taking feedback can be hard, which means we might not learn and grow very well in general. We are likely, if we're perfectionists, quick to retreat into ourselves, shut down, close off, right? If there's any criticism from ourselves or others. We can be more touchy. We can be defensive. We can be more unforgiving and more antagonistic. Like this inner kind of critical attitude towards ourselves and towards others ultimately breeds more hostility within ourselves. And sometimes our human psychology is such that we push that hostility out by directing anger at others. because it temporarily distracts us from our own feeling of inadequacy and shame, which obviously is not going to breed love and connection and all the good things that we want in our relationships, right? And we can have a harder time communicating, right? Like I talked about in that episode I mentioned earlier, like I call it authenticity inhibition. We might have so much self-criticality, so much hard emotion, so much nervous system shutdown from our perfectionism, such a lack of self-worth and self-sufficiency that communicating openly and honestly and from a self-responsible place is really hard. And perfectionism can keep us from being able to access love and loving intimacy and deep connection with ourselves. Right? We're unable to feel that in ourselves and bring it and have it in the culture of our marriage. I mean, really, it results in misery, exhaustion, burnout, anxiety, depression, mental, emotional exhaustion, nervous system dysregulation. It leads to a lack of evolution. And like I was saying a few minutes ago, like stunted growth, because it cuts us off from seeking the support and the information and the experience that would allow us to make progress in an incremental way in our lives and in our relationships. It leads to less learning. Like as my clients or as a listener to this podcast, you may expect yourself to take, like if you're a perfectionist, right? You may expect yourself to take all the podcast information that I've shared on perfectly, right? You might put pressure on yourself and beat yourself up if you aren't implementing it really well, which will only add shame to your system, to your experience, right? Which will actually only slow you down and make it harder to grow in yourself and harder to grow your marriage and shift things into that loving, joy-filled marriage that you want. So ironically, this perfectionism pattern leads to less to feel good about, lower self-esteem than ever, and really just like overlooking and never letting sink in your successes and moments of fulfillment and happiness is just never allowed space to actually exist. So, my friend, this is obviously not how you want to feel or how you want to live. Because if I know you, what you most want is a full, light, satisfied heart full of love and joy. And perfectionism will never get you that. You cannot perfect yourself to joy and happiness and worthiness and love. But you can get there. And it will mean releasing this habit of perfectionism. So the big question is how? How do you release that? Since everything in life comes from your relationship with yourself, dissolving perfectionism is about building a new loving relationship with yourself. When I mentioned that word source, heal it at the source, this is what I mean. Build a new loving relationship with yourself. Then you can stop pushing yourself to exhaustion and despair by constantly trying to prove yourself worthy of love, of approval. Remember that perfectionism is a confused attempt to try to be worthy, right? To make up for an underlying sense of not worthiness, of not enoughness. And so we need to go in to the source and bring worthiness in, not from the external, right? Not by trying to do all the things and be all the things to all the people, but by building worthiness within ourselves. And there are kind of 3 stages or 3 pieces to this that I want to just point out to you. The first one is we've got to start with self-acceptance. Acceptance for who you are as you are. Acceptance of your full humanness with all your quirks, all your idiosyncrasies, all the parts of who you are and how you show up. Now, I want you to understand that acceptance, we're going to talk about this later some other day in more depth, but acceptance does not mean not growing. It doesn't mean resignation. In fact, self-acceptance is in itself huge growth, and it opens the doors to more capacity for growth. It's not, I guess this is just who I am. I'll just have to deal with it, right? No, it's like, this is me and I'm good with that. And I can keep growing into who I most want to become. How fun. We're going to talk a tiny bit more about a really powerful little piece here of self-acceptance in a minute. But first, I want to share the next two pieces of healing the source of perfectionism. So the next step after self-acceptance is insourcing deep self-worth. Developing inherent, bone-deep self-worth. Now, of course, this is a huge part of the work that I do with my clients, and I'm not going to go into how to do that now. I've made 2 episodes, actually more than that really, but 2 specific episodes that I want to point you to for today. If you want to dive into some of this now, if you know perfectionism is a big issue for you and you want to start moving the needle on this even more, then I'm going to offer the tips I'm going to offer in this episode. But it's episode 34 and 35. The first one's called Insourcing Validation, and the second one is called Self-Worth in Love. And then the next level is developing deep self-love. I think of that as even further than self-worth. And again, this is deep work that I do with my clients. It's so powerful for HSPs, and the impact of it in our marriages is tremendous. Just marriage changing in the very best of ways. But the episode that I want to point you to on that, without going into too much, is episode 89, Loving Yourself to More Love in Your Marriage, 7 Keys. So dive into that one if you know that that's a place you could use some work and help. Or way better yet, always come coach with me and we'll change it bone deep. All right. So to no longer need this compensation strategy of perfectionism that does more harm than good, self-acceptance, self-worth, and self-love are the work. And they require attention on a few levels. In the mind, in the emotions, we might call this the body or heart, and in the nervous system. Building these things require melting blocks to seeing and feeling the wonderfulness of who you really are, and feeling into that wonderfulness in an embodied, experiential way, right? Really feeling it, knowing it bone deep. So these are not shifts that can be made from one podcast episode or in one day, but they are well worth the energy, as my clients can deeply attest. But for the moment, I want to share one specific tangible thing that you can do when you notice any of these perfectionistic tendencies kind of rear up in your experience, right? Maybe you feel the pressure to do something really right and really well. Whatever it is that resonated to you from this podcast today, when you notice yourself in that, and when you notice you're being fueled by those feelings of like pressure and anxiety and worry about getting it wrong, or like I need to get it right, etc., I want to invite you to try this. Accept these perfectionistic thoughts and feelings that have come along. Instead of resisting them, instead of being like, oh no, there's my perfectionism again, ugh, right? Like, instead of that, being like, oh, of course this is here. This is my unconscious way of trying to protect myself and helping myself know that I'm good enough. In other words, turn towards those perfectionistic feelings and tendencies and thoughts, behaviors, turn towards them and make friends with them. This is actually the first step in changing perfectionism. Instead of making an enemy of this pattern and making an enemy of the feelings that are part of this pattern, we want to befriend it. I've seen it time and again, how easy it is to, once we start to see how our patterns and defense mechanisms, such as perfectionism, are actually doing more harm than good, how easy it is to turn against them, to kind of think, oh, I'm going to go to war with this part of me, right? The natural tendency is to want to fight it. And I actually remember a beautiful training, for the most part, that I went to, where the teacher actually literally had us draw our inner critic, which is part and parcel of perfectionism, right? And put that piece of paper with our drawing of our inner critic on the floor and jump up and down and stomp all over it and then tear it up. Okay? This is not what I believe is going to help. What I and so many others have found is that turning this part of us into an enemy and going to war with this part of us that's actually only doing the best it knows how to actually help and support us, what that does is create a war zone inside of us, right? That fuels more self-hatred and inadequacy and pain, and actually fuels the cycle of perfectionism and other defense compensatory patterns like perfectionism that really just wreak havoc on our lives. You know that saying, what we resist persists? That's what this is. We don't want to resist it. We don't want to go to war with it. Ironically, the first step to healing and releasing perfectionism is accepting our perfectionism, befriending it, and even thanking this primal caretaker for what it's misguidedly trying to do for us. Because that's what it is. It's a primal caretaker, right? It's an unevolved way of caring for ourselves. And I speak passionately about this because, even just this morning, this is what released me from this, sticky, stuck, inhibiting experience of perfectionism. This is what allowed me to break through that stuckness this morning. Instead of railing against it and being so mad at it and trying to fight it and make it go away, I turned towards it and embraced it. Because I know that my perfectionism actually loves me. And it has always just been trying to support and protect me and bring me the love and approval that we all deeply need. Even if it's doing it in a way that isn't working so well, an unskillful way, right? So, when you notice your perfectionism rearing its head, ask it, what are you trying to do for me? What are you trying to provide for me? And you may even want to put your hand over your heart or wherever you kind of feel that those feelings that perfectionism is giving rise to in the moment, maybe that pressure, that urge to get it perfectly, right? And tell that part of you that you see what it's trying to do for you. And maybe even that you appreciate what it's trying to do for you. You might even tell it, you can be here. You can be here with me while my wiser, more evolved adult self learns to take over and provide these same needs for myself in a way that works so much better, in a way that actually results in more loving intimacy and a sense of belonging and connection with myself and others in this world, and a healthy mind, body, heart system. When I give my perfectionism permission in this way to just be there alongside, right, along for the ride, or any of my other sort of defensive strategies or primal caretakers, right, they actually relax and soften and step away from the driver's seat of my life and into the back seat. And sometimes they leave the car altogether. More and more, that's been my experience. And I am then able to settle into my full confidence, my full sense of sufficiency and worth, in connection with love for who I am. It's truly this softening inside of me and this beautiful connection with the value, worth, the love of who I really am. And it feels so much better, and I'm so much more clear-headed and able to actually do the things that I want to do in my life. say the things that I want to say from there. So try it. Try it. And although it's not the whole answer to moving beyond perfectionism and moving into deeper self-acceptance and self-worth and self-love, it's such a powerful beginning. So start here. When you can accept your whole self and start easing and eventually releasing this habit of perfectionism, it really does have this huge ripple effect in your marriage. Because a perfectionistic brain takes itself everywhere it goes, right? It takes itself into your relationship with your husband. But so does a loving, accepting, worth-seeing brain. So we do want to go from perfectionism and like judgy brain, right, to a brain that has acceptance, compassion, valuing, and love of humanness. Your humanness, your husband's humanness, which is non-negotiable, totally essential for a thriving marriage with another human being on this planet. So next episode, we're going to dive into that a bit more. Do stay tuned. But before you go, if you've been enjoying this podcast and you haven't yet left a review and a rating over on iTunes/Apple Podcasts, I would love it if you would. It would mean so much to me. So just you take a couple minutes of your time and head over there and leave a rating and review. It will help it reach more highly sensitive women like you who will just benefit from this podcast so much. So thank you so much ahead of time for doing so. And be oh so well, my friends.